At Geico, our community engagement strategy includes our commitment to promoting equity. We believe in supporting the communities where our associates live and work and promoting equity everywhere. We want to help build stronger communities for tomorrow by investing our time and energy today toward meaningful relationships with organizations that support equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion. We call it our insurance plan for the future, and it's a policy we're proud of. We're honored to be a partner and look forward to a positive future together.
Good morning, and welcome to our annual Sojourner Truth Legacy Project Virtual Summit. I am Nicole Austin Hillary, the newly appointed President and CEO of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Incorporated. I am so honored to serve in this new role and to have as one of my first official duties providing welcoming remarks to this historic summit. Today, we have the privilege of recognizing the nation's most influential, inspirational, and trailblazing Black women in American politics. These women embody the mission of the Sojourner Truth Legacy Project by increasing awareness of the issues affecting Black women and the community, mobilizing women committed to engaging and creating positive change, and building a connection of women through the So True Network to secure a more equitable nation for the next generation of leaders. As we look back and reflect on the inspiring work of Sojourner Truth, you cannot help but see similarities in the women you will hear from today. They continue her legacy in the most uplifting way and carry on her truth like a torch for others. I think Sojourner Truth said it best when she said this: "If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again." We are truly grateful that you all have gathered with us virtually today, and I cannot wait to get started. Now, please allow me the privilege of presenting to you the formidable Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, who represents Ohio's 3rd Congressional District and serves as the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congresswoman Beatty is a warrior with an indomitable spirit in the fight for women's empowerment and a trailblazer that continues to reach back and look beyond. Please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Joyce Beatty.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that gracious introduction. And my highest congratulations to you in your newest journey as the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's president and CEO. It is an honor to be here with you today as the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus. This morning, I am joined by my sisters, the women of the Congressional Black Caucus. Today, we come to engage in an open dialogue about voting rights and to remind America that we also have the right to fair and quality education, childcare, housing, economic, and social justice. As we draw near to the end of Women's History Month, there is no better time to have this critical conversation about the role Black women play in advancing American politics and, yes, protecting the right to vote. Although Sojourner Truth's life and calling began over 200 years ago, we are not far removed from her cause or her agenda. As we continue to push forward, demanding every right deserved, as we lift our voices and demand that our voting rights be accessible, exercised, and most importantly, counted. In 2020, we were heard and won, so much so that our votes have threatened the status quo. In the months that follow and today, we've seen a resurgence of restrictive voting rights, voting bills engineered to suppress, mute, and silence the Black vote. But our voice is power that we will not relinquish. Now is when it is most important to look to those before us. Inspirational women like Sojourner Truth have raised their voices with conviction, empowered those once silent, and stood firm to their vision, creating a domino effect of change that has influenced the world. Just as I've always have, I stand with my sisters today, Let us continue to lock arms in strength and power as we honor, celebrate, and draw wisdom from the legacy of Sojourner Truth. At this time, it is my privilege to present the chairwoman of the Sojourner Truth Legacy Project and my sister in public service, the fearless representative of New York's 9th District, Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke.
Congressional Black Caucus for that wonderful introduction. I am enamored with this sister's courageous leadership and delighted by her lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke, and I'm chairwoman of the Sojourner Truth Legacy Project, and I proudly represent New York's 9th Congressional District, that's Central and South Brooklyn. The Sojourner Truth Legacy Project is our driving force to connect in solidarity with other Black women and serve as each other's support system as we improve the lives of Black women and advance the global Black community. For over 13 years now, we have used this forum to bring together women across generations to address issues ranging from jobs to healthcare, to the advancement of women in government and business. This project builds a dynamic network of Black women committed to harnessing the power of the Black community around issues that will eliminate systemic barriers and ensure equity for all. As we continue to celebrate Women's History Month, we must also celebrate one of the most influential leaders in women's history, Black history, and American history, Sojourner Truth. Born in 1797 as Isabella Baumfree, Ms. Baumfree changed her name to Sojourner Truth so that her new name would embody the journey she knew was ahead of her. The truth that she preached inspired action from Hare's action towards abolition, temperance, civil and women's rights in the 19th century. Now in 2022, the 21st century, Black women are still proclaiming the truth. While a false narrative is being spread across the country, the truth to be proclaimed is that federal voting rights bill will not ban state voter ID laws. The truth is the federal voting rights bill will not bar states from removing ineligible voters from their rolls. The truth is the federal voting rights bill will not allow minors to vote. That is the truth that we must proclaim as we fight for our right to vote. Like our beloved Sojourner Truth, we have one such bold sister in our midst proclaiming the truth today. She is a pioneer, and it gives me joy to present a true daughter of the Sojourner Truth Legacy Project, one who is undaunted and immovable in the fight for the people she proudly serves in her district. Our dear sister, Sheila Jackson Lee, is the U.S. representative for Texas's 18th Congressional District. We are blessed to have such a dynamic sister in our presence today, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and Chairwoman Yvette Clarke for welcoming me to do this historical journey about Sojourner Truth. Born Isabella Baumfree in 1797, she received her freedom in 1826-27. And as well, she began her journey. And frankly, that is the kind of journey we had in the United States Congress to fight for the first African-American woman, slave woman, to be placed in the United States Capitol. Sojourner Truth was the very first. It was not an easy journey. I looked at the legacy of statements and years. We started in 1997 when I rose to say that the suffragette statute that is now in the rotunda, that had not yet been brought up from the basement, should not come up unless Sojourner Truth would be placed right there. We did not have a statute yet. We did not have legislation. But C. Dolores Tucker was fighting to ensure that Sojourner Truth could be recognized. And I'm so glad that I was tapped to join her in this effort. But ultimately, I introduced the legislation to establish a statute honoring Sojourner Truth that would come to the United States Congress. I'm glad to be joined in the United States Senate by Senator Hillary Clinton and Senator Arlen Specter. And so way into 2006, we finally were able to celebrate the passage of legislation that would allow this statute to be received. Let me be very clear. There was no other statute of a Black woman ever. And so, except for a head, I believe, that might have been here, or a picture was here. Shirley Chisholm's picture was not here. That is the power of what happens when Black women come together, the power of this Sojourner Truth Project that is led by the Honorable Yvette Clarke. We are making a difference. Our task is still not done. Sojourner Truth must be placed, as I had always dreamed, as we should want to have, right where the suffragettes are in the rotunda. And that's the challenge that I hope you'll all accept. That history that is placed now in the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and the histories and archives of the Congressional Black Caucus, and that of all of us who work so hard to make this happen. She is deserving of that. She fought in two ways: to fight against slavery and to ensure the rights of women. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Bumfree, but she truly did tell us the truth, and she sojourned across the land to speak freedom, to speak power, to speak equality and justice. Sojourner Truth. And this project, Sojourner Truth, will continue to be a giving project to give strength to young women and to bring generations of women together, and particularly those of us, African American women. The history of our strength is vested in Sojourner Truth. Ain't I a woman?
Let me thank our sister, our leader, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, for joining us today and for being a voice of truth and a voice of reason for so many across this nation. Today, we have women and people here of all ages who have been working together to advance women's equality for decades. They are a rising generation of activists, advocates, and leaders picking up the torch and telling their stories to break new ground and lift others out of the shadows. In a moment, we will hear from some of our nation's most influential and trusted voices as we engage in the critical conversation about the role Black women play in advancing American politics and protecting the precious right to vote. It is an honor and a privilege to moderate and present these phenomenal panelists and my CBC sisters. First, we have Congresswoman Gwen Moore, a powerhouse elected to proudly represent Wisconsin's 4th Congressional District. Congresswoman Moore is the first Black woman elected to Congress from the state of Wisconsin. This Congresswoman has been a champion for women, serving as the Democratic co-chair of the Congressional Women's Caucus from 2011 to 2013, and leading the fight for health insurance reform, women's health, maternal and infant mortality, and domestic violence. Thank you, Congresswoman Moore, for joining us today. I also welcome Congresswoman Terry Sewell to our panel. Congresswoman Sewell is in her 6th term representing Alabama's 7th Congressional District, the first Black woman to ever serve in the Alabama Congressional Delegation, and the newly elected chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's Board of Directors. Congratulations. Now, Congresswoman Sewell is no stranger to advocating for what is right. She passionately championed her first piece of legislation recognizing the 4 little girls who tragically lost their lives during the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. This bill was unanimously passed in both the houses of the Congress and was signed into law by President Obama on May 24th, 2013. What an honor it is to welcome Congresswoman Terry Sewell. Thank you all for such an inspiring and let me just get started. I want to start by having Congresswoman Terry Sewell tell us a bit about the struggle for voting rights and what inspires you to carry the torch forward and really lift Black women in this endeavor.
Well, first, I want to thank you, my dear colleague, Yvette Clarke, as well as my colleague, Gwen Moore, for being a part of this panel, and want to congratulate the newly chosen CEO and president, Nicole Austin Hillary, for her advocacy and continuing the legacy that is the Sojourner Truth Legacy Project. When I think about my life growing up in little Selma, Alabama, and now having the opportunity to represent Alabama in Congress, I know that that only occurred because of the struggle of so many, especially those that dared to stand on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and march from Selma to Montgomery. We know that that effort was initially met on Bloody Sunday by brutality from the Alabama State Troopers. But as John Lewis so gallantly said, sometimes you have to get into good trouble. And in fact, Congressman Lewis, our colleague, our esteemed colleague and dear friend and mentor to so many of us, said it best. The vote is the most sacred and the most effective nonviolent tool in our democracy. It must be protected at all costs. We as African Americans, of course, know that the right to vote did not come to Black men until the 15th Amendment, and did not come to women and Black women until the 19th Amendment. But we also know that the literacy tests and poll taxes prevented so many African Americans from voting. It was indeed an effort that really began on the streets of America and ended with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When I think about John and Amelia Boynton Robinson and Diane Nash and so many men and women, African American men and women who struggled for the right to vote, it sends chills down my back. I think that I would have never thought that the cause for which they were on a bridge, bludgeoned on a bridge in Selma 57 years ago, would now become our cause too. But we know that old battles become new again. And while we no longer have to count how many marbles are in a jar, we know that modern day barriers to voting are no less pernicious. We saw most recently the 2020 presidential election, which actually had the greatest participation of any presidential election. Over 17 million more people voted in the 2020 presidential election than they did in the 2016 election. But after that, the effects of that were that 49 legislatures across this nation introduced more restrictive voting laws. We saw state legislatures like Georgia now make it a crime to give a bottle of water to someone waiting to vote. We saw states all across this nation try to make it harder for people to vote. But I think that we have to get into good trouble. We have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make Congress live up to the ideals of this great nation of equality and justice for all, and to fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was gutted in 2013 by the Shelby versus Holder decision, which basically told Congress that the formula by which we determine which are the most egregious state actors was not constitutional. So the Supreme Court in 2013 ruled that Section 4 was unconstitutional, rendering Section 5, the enforceability of pre-clearance, null and void. It is that restriction, being able to effectively stop laws from coming into effect before they become law, that we no longer have in our toolkit. Federal oversight of voting laws is no longer as strong as it could be. We now only have Section 2, but even that has been threatened. as we know, by the Bonovich case, and most recently by the Supreme Court taking up the redistricting case in Alabama. So, my sisters, we have work to do. Only Congress can put back the full force and effect of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we did that on the House side by voting in favor of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. That bill has come up, and I have championed that bill in 4 successive Congresses since 2013. The difference this year is that we did so without our dear colleague, John Lewis. We have now named that bill after John Lewis, H.R. 4, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And we carry proudly that bill before the Senate. We know also that it was defeated in the Senate because of a procedural vote called the filibuster. And so we still stand now having to fight for the full protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I know that we women of the CBC, I know that we women who proudly carry the torch of Sojourner Truth's legacy will not be deterred. We have to fight even harder. It was a woman, Amelia Boynton Robinson, who I had the great honor of having as my special guest at the State of the Union. She was 103, and she was the last living survivor from Bloody Sunday. And she told us all that we have to make sure that we fight harder than ever before for the Voting Rights Act. When she had a chance to meet President Barack Obama, he kneeled down beside her right before he was giving that speech. And he said to her, "I want to thank you, Miss Amelia, for your courage. It's because of your courage that I get to give a speech as a president of the United States." And without missing a beat, Miss Amelia said, "Make it a good one." She also told all of us that we needed to get off her shoulders and do our own work. I can tell you that we women of the Congressional Black Caucus stand ready to continue to do our work, and work we must do. Thank you so much for the opportunity to sort of level set and give the overall view of what's going on in voting rights in America.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Sewell. You know, Terry Sewell, as we stated in her introduction, is from Alabama in the South, where we know that there's a legacy and a history of voter suppression laws, of really violent means of preventing our people from exercising their franchise. But oftentimes people overlook the Midwest. And so I'd like to bring to the fore Congresswoman Gwen Moore to talk about, what her experience has been in the state of Wisconsin, and to pose the question to her. Many argue against approaching challenges to voting rights as a racial justice issue. Why is it necessary to address voting rights through this lens?
Well, thank you so much. And just let me add my voice to thanking you, Yvette Clarke, for this stewardship over the Sojourner Truth Project and for choosing this very timely topic as we see our democracy sort of hanging in the balance. I just want to thank my sister, Miss Selma, as I call her, who really represents the voting right district in this country. I don't know whether it was clear from her presentation, but Selma, Alabama, literally is the home of the voting rights initiatives. I mean, that Edmund Pettus Bridge is a place where John Lewis was beaten over the head, and she represents in his historic march to Selma. And it's also the place where the case law for destroying the Voting Rights Act in Holder versus Shelby, that was a lawsuit. And I mean, almost immediately, after Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was stricken down, Alabama became one of the first places in that long laundry list of places that immediately went to pursue denying voting rights to people. But of course, as one of my mentors, God rest her soul, Vel Phillips, the only African-American until the last 2 years who had ever been elected statewide as Secretary of State here in the state of Wisconsin, once nicknamed Milwaukee as Selma of the North. because of our voting rights and our historic discrimination, gerrymandering, housing discrimination, and of course, voting was the same. You know, we Wisconsin used to be second to maybe only Minnesota in terms of numbers of people who came out to vote, because we had same-day registration, no onerous voter ID requirements. If you were 18 years old, your parents could literally vouch for you at the polling site to register you to vote. You could bring your current electric bill or your cell phone bill with your address on it to establish your identity. And of course, again, we had same-day registration. We had absentee voting with no excuse. But when Donald Trump lost in a very close election, he won Wisconsin in 2016 and lost in 2020 very narrowly. Suddenly, our laws had to change. And literally, right now, we're in the midst of an election right now, a spring election, which is to occur on April 5th. And a Waukesha, a Republican county circuit court judge, brought a suit forward by two conservative men saying that that they wanted to outlaw drop boxes, which were used very heavily in 2020 due to the pandemic. And of course, as you all know, the post office has pulled up all of the blue boxes, so you can't just run to the corner and mail your absentee ballot. They won a lawsuit saying that interpreting Wisconsin law to say that an absentee ballot voter had to personally mail their absentee ballot in or present their absentee ballot in person. That has a chilling impact on low-income voters, elderly voters, and disabled voters. And while they claim to have provisions for disabled voters, how we're going to administer this law is very puzzling to me. And it will be in effect for our April 5th elections of judges and a new mayor for the city of Milwaukee. That literally, if you have an absentee ballot, you got to figure out, as this elderly, disabled person, someone with 5 kids that really can't leave them in the house by themselves. You got a mother with Alzheimer's. You can't send your absentee ballot by your husband or your cousin or your neighbors to turn it in or to mail it. There will be no drop boxes. And so this was all done because they saw African Americans voting. And this is a way to do it. Numbers of other things that have happened in Wisconsin. We, of course, was one of the states, and you recognize all of the states that came very, very close, and Donald Trump won in 2016 and lost in 2020. We have a former Wisconsin State Supreme Court judge that has spent almost $700,000 of taxpayers' money investigating voter fraud, which even Republicans have admitted does not exist, saying that we need to decertify our 2020 election and that we ought to allow no absentee voting whatsoever. These are the kinds of far right-wing efforts that are being made in various states. And of course, we're one of the states that had the fake electors. And of course, our election commission is providing absolutely no punishment for them. And there are legislative efforts now among the Republican majority in the state of Wisconsin in the legislature to disband the Wisconsin Election Commission and to enable the state legislature, which is firmly in the hands of Republicans due to the gerrymandered maps, to be able to determine the electoral count. I mean, Wisconsin, which, you know, is home to the fighting Bob LaFollette, and a state that's known for its progressive values, it looks like it's leading the charge in suppressing the votes of people, particularly on the very small minority. We only have 6% of the population, but in a state where Democrats and Republicans are about equal, and Democrats and Republicans win or lose on the margins, denying the vote to African Americans is a major initiative. I just, before I close and redirect the discussion to our moderator, Yvette Clark, I just want to say this. African Americans have always made a difference in the state of Wisconsin. And because we are hyper segregated and we primarily live in the city of Milwaukee, it was very easy for Donald Trump and his party to target Milwaukee voters during their so-called investigation of voter fraud. And as you recall, the only votes that they wanted to throw out, that they wanted to re-examine in the state of Wisconsin, were votes from Milwaukee and from Dane County, two places where there are larger numbers of African Americans. So to say that it's not targeted toward African Americans is someone's wish, because it's not true. And I yield back to you, Yvette.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Your perspective is important for everyone to know because, again, I think that we become a bit hardwired on the tactics that have taken place in the South of our country, but not looking at the ways in which across this nation, voter suppression has really gathered steam. You know, Terry, I wanted to circle back to you just very quickly, as you mentioned about how the Supreme Court in June of 2013 struck down the coverage formula used for Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required jurisdictions with significant histories of voter discrimination to pre-clear a new voting practices or procedures, requiring jurisdictions to obtain approval from the Department of Justice and show that they do not have a discriminatory purpose or effect. How has this impacted the influx of voter suppression laws that we're seeing across our nation?
Well, thank you. You know, before the 2013 decision in Shelby versus Holder, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 for 25 years passed both houses and was signed by George W. Bush in 2006. So, but for the Shelby versus Holder decision, we would still be living under the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I want to note, as Gwen so eloquently talked about the Midwest, the reality is that of the 16 covered jurisdiction, it included parts of New York. Parts of New York were included, as well as parts of Arizona. It wasn't just a Southern thing. But when the Supreme Court struck it down, it said that Congress, because we had not changed the formula to determine which states are the most egregious actors in the 50 plus years that we had the Voting Rights Act, that we were somehow penalizing the Southerners for actions that took place in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And that wasn't fair. After all, in 2013, we had an African-American president. So the effect of the 2013 Shelby versus Holder decision was to literally throw out the old coverage formula. And so what the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does is we do a modern day formula. We have a look back of 25 years. So 1997 going forward, we looking at whether or not states across this nation have had 10 or more adjudicated violations of voter discrimination. And we found lots of states and parts of states that did have that. And so what we're trying to do is restore federal oversight. That absent federal oversight, which would allow us to stop laws from coming into effect through preclearance before they come effective, we lose that prophylactic, preventative measure. It's hard to unring a bell. Now we only have in our arsenal of protection Section 2, which allows us to sue after the fact, to say that these laws have had a discriminatory impact on an election, which is like trying to unring the bell. But that too is now been jeopardized by the Supreme Court. A Supreme Court, by the way, that it seems to be hell-bent on doing away with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 altogether. Under this mercurial, thought that somehow, because we have more elected officials that are African American, because we have had a Black president of the United States, and we currently have an African American woman as vice president, somehow voter suppression no longer lives, but rather the Republicans want you to think that it's voter fraud that is the most prevalent. And yet, case after case and study after study, including a most recent Brennan Center study, shows that evidence of voter fraud are minuscule compared to voter suppression. And so the real problem that we have to fight is voter suppression. So what the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would do is put federal oversight back into effect. Frankly, Yvette, I think if it were left up to you and me and so many of us in the Congressional Black Caucus, we would want, because voting is so paramount to our democracy, we would want that protection for all 50 states. But we understand that we have to now narrow it down to the most egregious actors. And that is exactly what this bill would do. And I can tell you that voter suppression is alive and well. We see it in the purging of rolls. We see it in certain IDs being chosen over other IDs. Just as Gwen said, in the state of Alabama, prior to the Shelby versus Holder decision, we could go and show a utility bill and be able to show our address to be able to get our ballot. Now, those options are limited to 9, which includes a hunting license, but not a school ID. That's how you pick losers and winners and losers in this, this battle of voter voting. And we know that every American, no matter what your race is or gender is or your ethnicity or disability or not, every American should have the equal right to vote. And that was decisively determined by the amazing ability of ordinary Americans taking up and being, in a nonviolent way, aggrieving this nation for the equal right of all Americans to vote. It is a sacred right. And while some of us may feel discouraged by the most recent procedural vote that stopped us from passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and signing it into law by President Biden, I submit to all of us that our foremothers and our forefathers, they had it way worse and they didn't give up. Can you imagine what would have happened if John Lewis and Amelia Boynton Robinson and Hosea Williams and all of those who were bludgeoned on that bridge didn't go back to Brown Chapel, the historic Brown Chapel AME Church, dust themselves off, and 2 days later, turnaround Tuesday, go and march again? So I think that they have given us a great roadmap. These foremothers and forefathers, they were tacticians. It wasn't by happenstance that they came to Selma. They came to Selma and they went to Birmingham because they knew that that those were the places that would be the battlegrounds by which the most egregious actions by the state would occur. And we need to take a page out of their playbook. And we too must not give up and not give in, but speak up and speak out. I just want to say that it was John Lewis, literally on the last time he was on that bridge, and if I close my eyes, I can hear him say it, who told us that we have to vote like we've never voted before. He told us to never give up, never give in, to keep the faith and keep our eyes on the prize. And I can tell you that we, the women of the Congressional Black Caucus, we, the women who are the bearers of the torch of Sojourner Truth and so many foremothers will not give up, will not give in. We know our work is not done, and we will continue to fight and make sure that we try to get federal oversight back into voting, because our lives do depend on it. The lives of our constituents depend on it, because we know that government, in voting, your vote is your voice. And to silence your voice is to give up power. And we refuse to do that.
Well, let me thank our powerful sister, Terry Sewell of Alabama, for really putting us square and in front of this issue. Her work has been legendary, and the baton had been passed to Terry Sewell from the late, great John Robert Lewis. And we, as the women of the CBC, stand shoulder to shoulder with Terry to make sure that our commitment and that her energy is renewed and strengthened so that we get this across the finish line. Let me thank Terry for joining us today. I know that she's got a very busy schedule, and we're going to continue with our panel with one final question for Rep. Gwen Moore before we end. Let me thank you. Stay safe and stay strong, my sister, and thank you for all of your dedication and hard work. You were indeed born in the cradle of the liberation of people of African descent and their right to vote, and that is Selma, Alabama. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Should the Congresswoman Gwen Moore, should the federal government take the lead as it did, passing the Voting Rights Act and pass a version of the Freedom to Vote Act, or should we rely on individual states to protect the right to vote? What are your thoughts on that?
This is the essential question that is, I believe, before the Supreme Court and before Congress, because we do have the Commerce Clause, the 10th Amendment, the argument about quote unquote states' rights, but the states' rights do not overcome protections under the 14th, 15th, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, which really give people their right to vote. And I think that that's the argument that has to be made, that the right to vote supersedes all those. Now, there's an argument that there's no right to vote. And, as if you've listened to the arguments of our most recent nominee to the Supreme Court, she talks about the 14th Amendment as having some implicit rights sort of built into it, that whole equal protection clause. As that's what I worry about. If we have a country with one man, one vote principle, how does it work? If my right to vote is protected in the state of New York, but if I live in Wisconsin, all kinds of onerous restrictions, there are not going to be any mailboxes nearby, any drop boxes. I can't get an absentee ballot unless I have an excuse. If I have an absentee ballot, I have to go and mail it myself. How will that stand up to the Equal Protection Clause, which is one of the reasons that we need a federal remedy so that we don't have 50 different solutions, different ways to address basic fundamental voting rights. Obviously, the federal government is not going to come in and be able to pick out every library and every school and every church basement that could be a polling place. But I think the federal government can lay the framework and the bottom of any sort of voting rights legislation. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to take over the administration of voting from counties and states and municipalities. I think that, I respect that, but there's got to be, and we have seen, because of the overwhelming desire to disenfranchise people, that there's got to be a federal solution.
Well, thank you so much, Gwen. We can't emphasize what you have stated enough. And we need to make sure that folks in our audience are marshaled and mobilized around a national standard for voting in our country. So let me thank you, Congresswoman Gwen Moore. Remember, I always have your back. And thank you for sharing your lived experience and expertise with us for today's panel. I want to thank you all for such an inspiring and progressive discussion. I don't know about you, but I must say that I am genuinely inspired about today's discussion with our CBC sisters. Thank you to our panelists, Congresswoman Terry Sewell of Alabama and Congresswoman Gwen Moore of Wisconsin, and you, the audience, for joining us this morning. Also, thank you to our sponsors, Geico, Philip Morris International, Salesforce, and the League of Women Voters for supporting today's virtual summit. We can't thank you enough for your partnership and commitment as we celebrate the amazing work of Black women leaders in politics throughout the summit today. Now, before we get ready for our next panel, I have 3 requests that I'd like to make of you, and they're really easy to do. Number 1, we want your feedback. Please scan the QR code to complete a survey of today's event. Your input helps CBCF meet your needs for future events, so we want to make sure that we hear from you. Number 2, stay in the know about what's going on at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation by following them on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And be sure to include the official event hashtag, So True. That's SOTRU, to stay in the conversation. And finally, spread the word. Today's summit will be available on demand here on the virtual platform starting tomorrow. Please encourage anyone you know who couldn't attend to check it out. And also save the date for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's Policy for the People 2022 Health Equity Summit on May 12th. Stay tuned for more information on the cbcfinc.org as the date approaches. Coming up next is the second and final summit session. Our focus will center on celebrating Black women mayors and Black women in C-suite roles. We will highlight their leadership, how they're influencing national trends, and how they are inspiring other women to lead. We will now take a small break, but invite you in the interim to explore the summit platform where you can network with other attendees and find engaging content. But come back and join us for session number 2. We hope to see you soon.